You ever get that feeling when you arrive somewhere new, like uh, you've built up this whole image in your head, from books and stories and such, but then reality is totally different.
Yeah, I think we've all been there. Expectations versus reality, right?
That's exactly what happened to me when I first set foot in Jamaica back in December 1906. I was expecting this vibrant, bustling island, but instead, it was almost eerily still. The sunshine was so intense, almost painful, and the air was just heavy and completely windless. Not a hint of those famous trade winds I'd read so much about.
What a contrast, huh?
A huge contrast. And looking back, I know it's kind of spooky to think that just weeks later, that calm was shattered in a way no one could have imagined. But before we get into that, let me properly introduce things. Welcome to Occult Archives.
Where we uncover the mysteries, myths, and legends behind history's most, well, feared books.
That's right. From mystical grimoires to ancient religious texts, we delve into the secrets these books hold, secrets that some might say are just too dangerous to be read.
But we read them anyway, so you don't have to.
Exactly. And today we're diving deep into Psychic Phenomena of Jamaica.pdf, exploring those strange and unsettling events that seem to defy explanation.
It's interesting you mentioning that feeling of stillness before the storm because it really echoes what we see in this document.
Oh, absolutely. We're not talking about tourist brochures and idyllic beaches here.
No, no, no. Think more like venturing into the shadows, the realm of belief and the unexplained. We're going to be looking at accounts of, well, psychic phenomena, superstitions, and some pretty strange happenings in Jamaica, primarily those that can be traced back to the African traditions that persisted and even flourished during the time of slavery.
The goal here isn't to, definitively prove or disprove anything, but to understand what was actually observed, what people believed, and how the unique cultural context of Jamaica shaped those interpretations.
Exactly. The author makes it very clear that it's about understanding the experiences and beliefs as they were documented, within that very particular time and place.
So imagine this. We're starting with this sense of foreboding, a premonition of something terrible about to happen. Then we'll step into the world of Jamaican ghost stories. We're talking about duppies, the spirits of the departed, and these creepy creatures called rolling calves.
We're also going to explore obeah and nihilism practices that blend spirituality and, well, let's just say, a different kind of power.
And we'll even touch on cases that look a lot like what we might call poltergeist activity. All of this, of course, viewed through the lens of Jamaican history and culture.
And honestly, what better place to start than that dramatic lead up to the 1907 earthquake? It really sets the stage for how people interpreted unusual events, especially those that seem to foretell disaster.
Oh, for sure. It's January 14th, 1907. Picture it, Ewerton Railway Station. I'm there, waiting for my train back to Kingston, and I see this incredibly disturbing scene. This young woman, clearly well off, well-dressed and all, is just completely hysterical.
Sounds intense.
Intense is an understatement. She's sobbing uncontrollably, clinging to her father, and keeps repeating over and over, "Father, we should never have left home today. I told you that something dreadful is going to happen." And the author specifically mentions her refined background, almost as if to say this wasn't just some, random emotional outburst.
Yeah, that detail about her social standing is interesting. It's like the author's preempting any doubt about the genuineness of her distress.
Right. And then there's the weather. The author describes this strange, almost oppressive heat. The sky is completely cloudless. And get this, there's absolutely no wind. No wind at all. And this is when the trade winds should have been at their strongest.
So everything's just off.
Everything is off. He describes this almost tangible stillness, this blinding sunshine. It's almost as if, I don't know, as if nature itself was holding its breath.
You can definitely see how that would add to this sense of, impending doom, especially after that young woman's outburst.
And then, just about half an hour after the father and daughter leave, the ground starts to tremble. There's this crackling, sputtering sound, which the author compares to the discharge of a gigantic Leyden jar, an early type of capacitor. And then, the earthquake.
Wow.
My watch showed the time as exactly 18 minutes past 3.
So precise. You always remember the exact time in moments like that. And I bet that detail, that specific time, became even more significant after what happened in Kingston.
Oh, absolutely. I arrived in Kingston the next morning, and the devastation. It was just unimaginable. Buildings reduced to rubble, fire still burning, over 1,000 people dead, just like that, and countless more injured.
It's hard to even comprehend the scale of that kind of tragedy.
It really is. And amidst all this chaos, I kept hearing these whispers, these stories about this prophet, a strange figure who was supposedly walking through Kingston hours before the earthquake, shouting warnings. Warnings that everyone ignored, some even laughed at.
It's almost like something out of a biblical story, isn't it? The prophet ignored, then disaster strikes.
Exactly. And normally, you might dismiss such tales, right? Just rumors, the kind that spring up after a tragedy, people trying to make sense of it all.
Yeah, like grasping at straws.
But the memory of that young woman at the station, her genuine terror,
Yeah.
it really stuck with me. So I did something a little unusual. I asked around, specifically those people I knew to be the most level-headed, my colleagues, about this prophet story.
So not the type to be easily swayed by rumors.
Exactly. And you know what? They all independently confirmed hearing about this warning hours before the earthquake.
So it wasn't just like hindsight bias or anything. The story was already circulating.
And here's the kicker. Years later, in 1921, the Times of London actually reported on this incident. They even mentioned the man wearing a red mantle, described him as irresponsible, and said he appeared in Kingston that morning, warning of the city's destruction.
It's amazing how these things can resurface even years later.
It is. Anyway, the days after the earthquake were just filled with this palpable fear. Rumors of more disasters to come, people were on edge. The Bedwardites, a local religious group, actually adapted their hymns to reflect this new reality.
How so?
They'd parade through the ruined city in white, that characteristic nihilistic hip movement singing, "It is a warning, it is a warning, on the dreadful judgment day, heaven and earth will pass away. It is a warning, it is a warning. On the dreadful judgment day, there'll be no warning."
Yeah, it's a stark image. People trying to find meaning, even solace, in the midst of tragedy.
That's exactly what it was. And it's a good segue into our next topic, duppies, or ghosts, as we might call them.
Everyone loves a good ghost story. So what's the Jamaican take on these spirits of the departed?
Well, the author explains that duppies are believed to be the spirits of those who have died. And often they haunt places that were important to them in life or connected to their death.
That's pretty standard ghost story stuff.
It is. But here's where it gets interesting. These duppies, they're not necessarily seen as peaceful or benevolent.
Oh.
Their interest in the living is often described as, well, selfish, malicious, even vengeful. They're not just lost souls looking for peace. They can be trouble.
So they're active, not just passive. That's a little more unsettling.
Definitely unsettling.
Yeah.
And the author shares this rather fascinating story from the All Saints mission. It was already known for strange occurrences. A lady and a gentleman had reportedly disappeared without a trace, for instance. Anyway, one moonlit night, I was sleeping there on a sofa in this big front room. There was a passage leading to the back, closed off by these swinging doors. Now, with no curtains on the windows, the moonlight was so bright I could have easily read a book.
Sounds peaceful until
Those doors started swinging.
Classic ghost story moment right there.
Right. Back and forth in perfect unison. I even touched them. They stopped immediately. But as soon as I let go, they started again. No draft, no explanation at all. This went on for nearly an hour.
Did you ever figure out what caused it?
Nope. It's one of those things that just stays with you.
Takes you wonder, doesn't it?
It really does. And then there's this idea of the four-eyed or the four-eyed. These are people believed to have a sort of second sight.
Meaning?
They can see duppies, communicate with them without needing any special rituals or anything. It's just there.
Like a sixth sense specifically for the spirit world.
Exactly. And it's not always a gift, from what I gathered. It can be pretty unsettling. Anyway, there were all sorts of stories about duppies causing mischief in houses, doors slamming, furniture being overturned, even curtains being drawn. But there's this one story that really stood out.
Oh, what happened?
It involves a house that was considered, well, haunted. I remember the narrator initially dismissed all the weird noises as rats, typical stuff. But the woman living there, she had these really disturbing experiences.
Disturbing how?
Like being physically led by the arm by something she couldn't see, hearing footsteps all the time when no one else was there, water being splashed, even the sensation of another body in bed with her.
That's more than just your average spooky noises. That's terrifying.
It gets worse. She even claimed to have been struck in the abdomen by a ghost.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's these kinds of physical manifestations that often get labeled as what we now call poltergeist activity.
But in this context, it's all tied to duppies, isn't it?
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that within Jamaican folklore, These beliefs can encompass a whole range of supernatural phenomena. Yeah. It's not always so neatly categorized.
I get it. It's more about the overall belief system than the specific label.
Right. And then there's this belief that duppies actually need to be fed, like they eat and drink, and they get angry if you don't leave something out for them at night.
So it's almost like a form of respect or appeasement, like keeping on their good side.
That's the idea, yeah. And it suggests that the line between the living and the dead, well, it's a bit more blurry in their belief system.
Makes you wonder if those boundaries are really as solid as we sometimes assume.
Doesn't it? And finally, on duppies, there's this strong connection to the odum, or silk cotton tree.
What's so special about this tree?
Well, it's believed to be the dwelling place of duppies, and the author even suggests there might be a link between the word duppy and a related term dupon, which further ties the tree to these spirits.
That's fascinating. It's like the tree itself becomes a symbol, a representation of the spirit world.
Exactly. Now, ready for something even creepier?
Lay it on me.
We're talking about rolling calves. Imagine these malevolent spirits that roam around at night, but they can take the form of different animals. Cats, dogs, even pigs.
Shape-shifting evil spirits. Lovely.
And they often have a chain attached to their necks, dragging along as they move. People claim to hear the rattling of these chains in their yards at night, and some even see them fighting with their dogs.
So they're not just wandering around aimlessly. They seem to have some malicious intent.
Oh, absolutely. They're definitely not friendly.
And you said they can appear as different animals, anything specific or...
It seems to vary, but the image of this shadowy creature dragging a chain, it's really ingrained in the folklore.
I bet it is. It's a potent image full of menace.
And like duppies, rolling calves have specific daytime hiding spots. The roots of cotton trees, inside bamboo thickets, caves, those sorts of places.
And again, only visible to those with the four-eyed ability, right?
Exactly. So it's like this whole other layer of reality that most people can't even perceive.
Except for those select few who can see it all. Must be quite a burden in a way.
Now, here's a curious detail. Rolling calves are apparently quite fond of molasses. They're supposedly drawn to sugar estates and the carts that transport sugar. Almost a funny image, isn't it? This terrifying creature with a sweet tooth.
It's those little details that, that make these stories stick with you.
Absolutely. The author even mentions this educated man who encountered a large black creature late one night, became convinced it was a rolling calf, and got so scared he actually fell ill.
Shows the power of belief, doesn't it?
It really does. And there's this other description, the rolling calf with blazing red eyes, that clanking chain. And get this, there's a specific way to escape one. You stick a penknife into the ground and run without looking back. Classic folklore, right?
It's like those rules in a horror movie, you know? You gotta follow the rules to survive.
Exactly. And here's the crucial link. Rolling calves are often associated with dangerous duppies. And even worse, they can be set on people by obeah-men.
So they become a weapon, basically. A tool for those who practice obeah.
That's the belief, yeah. Which brings us to the world of obeah and Mayaism, practices that are, well, let's just say they delve into the more shadowy side of spirituality.
Shadowy in what sense?
Well, the author makes a very specific point of saying that his study focuses only on Jamaican phenomena with African roots. He intentionally excludes any European superstitions.
It was about preserving the authenticity of these traditions.
Exactly. And it highlights just how much those African traditions, especially those brought over during slavery, shaped the island's spiritual landscape. Really fascinating stuff. And when you look at the historical influence of the Coromantans, who are mostly from the Ashanti region in West Africa, you start to see those connections.
Connections to what, specifically?
Language, naming customs, those day names you still hear in Jamaica, Kojo, Kwashi, and most importantly for our discussion, the practice of obeah.
So obeah has direct links to West African traditions.
It does. Now, the plantation owners, fearing rebellions and such, they cracked down hard on any Ashanti religious practices, especially drumming.
Makes sense. They wouldn't want anything that could potentially unite the enslaved population.
Exactly. But the Ashanti priests, they were clever. They disguised these practices within dances that were deemed acceptable. And this, over time, evolved into the mile dance and the figure of the mile man.
So it's a form of cultural resistance almost, preserving their traditions under the guise of something else.
It really is. Now, Mileism, as it's described here, it's more of the traditional tribal religion, focused on minor deities and ancestral spirits. Obeah, on the other hand, became associated with what we might call witchcraft, the use of supernatural forces for harmful purposes.
So Mialism is the more orthodox practice, and obey is the darker, more feared one. Is that right?
You got it. And legally speaking, obeah first gets mentioned specifically in a 1760 act.
An act about.
It was a direct response to fears about obeah's influence on the slaves, particularly the fear that it could be used to incite rebellion. And even though the act didn't ultimately become law, it shows just how seriously the authorities were taking this.
It wasn't just dismissed as superstition. They saw it as a real threat.
Exactly. Now, Edward Long, an early Jamaican historian, he had a pretty dismissive view of obeah-men, called them pretended conjurers who use poisons and trickery to create an illusion of power.
So he's basically saying it's all smoke and mirrors, no real magic involved.
That's his take, yeah. But then you have these missionaries who came later, and they painted a much different picture. They described obeah as this mix of magic and witchcraft, involving genuine supernatural power, and they directly linked it to the devil, even called Satan the invisible head of obeah.
So it's demonized, essentially.
Completely demonized. And it seems that over time, the lines between the Mile Man and the obeah man became blurry. The roles started to merge.
Maybe because of the suppression, right? They had to adapt and find ways to keep their practices alive, even if it meant blurring those lines.
That's a good point. And to show just how persistent these beliefs were, the author includes these newspaper clippings from the 1930s, from the Daily Gleaner, people being charged with practicing obeah, reasons ranging from, like, fixing someone they had a grudge against to trying to get their job back.
So it was still very much part of the fabric of society, not just something from the past.
Absolutely. And then there are these confessions from self-proclaimed obeah-men,
Confessions of what?
talking about their abilities to kill, cause madness, inflict all sorts of harm. Now, who knows how much of it is true, right? Maybe exaggerated, maybe coerced, but it definitely fed into the fear and mystery surrounding obeah.
It would, yeah. Even if it wasn't all true, those stories would spread and add to the sense of danger.
And there's this interesting distinction made between what's considered real obeah, the really potent, dangerous stuff, and then the more everyday applied magic, like using charms for luck or protection, things like that.
So there's a spectrum, a hierarchy almost, the real deal versus the more mundane stuff.
Exactly. Now, are you ready to delve into something a bit different? We're going to talk about those poltergeist-like events that we touched on earlier.
You mean those stone-throwing incidents? Always found those intriguing. Go ahead.
So the first one is this case at the Alva School, early 20th century. Stones being thrown, and of course everyone blamed it on duppies.
Makes sense in that context.
But the details are what's really odd. The stones seemed to be coming from this bushy ravine, but no one ever saw anyone throwing them. And get this, those who got hit by the stones, they weren't injured.
Unharmed. That's unusual.
And even weirder, some stones went through windows and then seemed to change direction in midair, hitting objects on a sideboard inside.
Almost as if they were being controlled.
Right. And the school teacher, even the local storekeeper, they were convinced it was spirits. I even went to the school myself and saw all the broken windows, the stones scattered about. It was unsettling.
I bet. A place that's supposed to be safe, a place of learning, suddenly becomes a target for these unseen forces.
Exactly. And then there's the Roehampton ghost mystery of 1931. In this case, it was a teacher, Miss Johnson, who was the target. Unseen hands throwing things at her. And she even claimed to be possessed by a spirit at one point.
Now that one made the newspapers, didn't it? I remember reading about it. Caused quite a stir.
It did. And the Daily Gleaner's coverage is really fascinating. They go from this cautious openness to skepticism, then back again. First, they're almost suggesting a formal investigation, and then they're pushing for rational explanations like abnormal psychology or autosuggestion.
Sounds like they were caught between wanting to report on this sensational event and trying to maintain a sense of journalistic integrity.
Probably. But their editorial did point out something very interesting, how common these stone-throwing incidents seem to be in Jamaica. It's not just an isolated event, it's like a recurring theme.
That does make you wonder, why that specific phenomenon and why so prevalent in that particular place? It's a question worth exploring.
And, you know, even I, after all my research and skepticism, I have to admit, there were times when I felt, well, like something unnatural was truly at play, even if I couldn't definitively say it was supernatural.
Those moments where logic just doesn't quite cut it.
Exactly. And it's not unique to Jamaica either. The Ashanti, for example, they have these spirit beings called Red Moashia, and guess what they do? Throw stones.
So there are parallels, similar beliefs in other cultures. Makes you think about those connections, those shared threads that run through different traditions.
It does, and it all ties into this bigger question of belief and the power it holds. The author really emphasizes this point. The power of belief in obey, the fear it can generate, can literally cause people to become sick, depressed, even die.
It's the nocebo effect, in a way. If you believe something will harm you, it very well might, even if there's no actual physical cause.
That's it exactly.
Yeah.
And even educated Jamaicans, those who might scoff at these beliefs in public, well, I noticed a certain respect, even fear, especially when night falls.
It's like those childhood fears, you know? They might fade, but they never truly disappear.
That's a good way to put it. And there's this Ashanti proverb that really sums it up. If the spirit world possesses nothing else, it has at least the power of its name. Just the idea of it, the concept, holds a certain sway.
It's like giving it a form, a presence, even if it's unseen. Makes it real, in a way.
Right. And speaking of the spirit world, we should touch on funerary customs in Jamaica. They're quite elaborate, a mix of African and Christian traditions. It's really fascinating.
Funerals are always a window into a culture's beliefs and values. What stood out to you about the Jamaican customs?
Well, there's this custom called carrying the corpse, which is used to identify a witch who is believed to have caused the death. The idea is that the corpse will actually guide the carriers to the guilty party.
Wow. That's
It really is. It speaks to this deep belief in the connection between the living and the dead, and the idea that justice can be served even beyond the graves. Powerful stuff.
powerful and a little bit scary, to be honest.
Now, to wrap things up, we need to address this rather controversial claim that obeah is essentially a form of devil worship.
Because of its association with evil forces.
Exactly. It's seen through that lens, judged by those standards. But the author, he makes this interesting point. He says that while obeah-men might invoke the evil one, true diabolic control is probably pretty rare. And even then, it's only allowed by divine providence.
So he's acknowledging the intent, the language, but not necessarily saying they have that level of power.
Right. He even compares it to modern spiritualism in the U.S., suggesting that maybe we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss these Jamaican practices as mere superstition. Because the fascination with the occult, with the unseen, it's not limited to any one culture or time period. It's a human thing.
That's a great point. We all have our ways of trying to understand what we don't know, what lies beyond our immediate perception.
So that's our deep dive into Psychic Phenomena of Jamaica.pdf. We've covered a lot, from unsettling premonitions to those creepy rolling calves, and delved into the complex world of obeah and nihilism.
And we did it all within the unique context of Jamaican history and culture, which is crucial to understanding these beliefs.
What's striking to me is how resilient these beliefs are. They persist even in the face of skepticism and modern explanations.
It shows how deeply rooted they are in the culture, in the human psyche.
And that brings us to a final thought for you, dear listener. What do these enduring beliefs tell us about ourselves? About our need to understand the unknown, to cope with the mysteries of life and death, and to find meaning in a world that often seems chaotic and unpredictable.
Maybe by exploring these beliefs, even those that seem strange or foreign to us, we can learn something about our own need to believe, our own search for answers in the face of the unknown.
Something to think about. Until next time, keep exploring those shadows, keep questioning, keep seeking those hidden truths.